this next topic is how to make effective use of ATI and FOI. And I looked at the title and I thought, I wonder what people think if they don't know what these two acronyms are. And I talked to a friend and she said, well, they sound like diseases. And so if you don't know what these two are, I can assure you we're not going to talk about how you can inflict diseases on your political opponents. What we're essentially talking about in this session is how you can use what's known as freedom of information, FOI, and ATI, access to information. These are two processes at the federal and provincial level that allow people to basically get information out of the government. And they can often be quite helpful. And so before I introduce our guests today that are going to be talking to this about this topic, I'm going to give you a couple examples of stories and ways that this can be helpful for everyone. Because these two tools can be helpful for people. It doesn't matter if you're working in media, if you're working for an advocacy organization, a think tank, maybe a political party. These can be very effective tools. And so I'm going to start off with a little bit of a trivia question here. Does anybody know who this lady is? A few people, I can see hands going up. This is Bev Oda. Does everyone remember her name? She was a member of parliament for about 12 years in Ottawa. And does anyone remember what she was unfortunately famous for? I can hear a few people saying it. Yeah, she expensed a $16 glass of orange juice. This is a lady, I believe from British Columbia, who commuted to Ottawa for about 12 years. She served in cabinet, and her career, unfortunately for her and in many people's eyes, distilled down into a $16 glass of orange juice that she expensed in Europe. And we know this because the Canadian press filed an access to information request. They asked her department about her expenses, and this was one of the expenses, and it became symbolic for waste during her term as minister. What about this lady here? I can hear someone over here knew the name. This is Zipporah Berman, and she's an environmentalist, and I'm going to put this in air quotes, because she's like a lot of other environmentalists. They don't really practice what they preach. Rachel Notley appointed her to the Oil Sands Advisory Committee a few years ago when she was premier. And Zipporah Berman was living in British Columbia at the time, and I thought, okay, well, let's take a look at these expenses. If she's going to be appointed to an Alberta committee, then she's probably handing in some bills, and let's see what they look like. And discovered that through filing a Freedom of Information request, I was able to get a copy of this receipt. This shows that she lives on an island, Cortes Island, off the coast of British Columbia. So every time she would come to Alberta for one of these meetings, she would fly from Cortes Island on a little prop jet or whatever they're called to Vancouver, and then fly from there to Edmonton, which of course is better for the environment than video conferencing in and reducing your emissions. But what was really interesting was that in one of the expenses, we noticed this, and you can see here that she's an Aeroplan member. She's a frequent flyer, and I thought, well, why on earth is an environmentalist a frequent flyer if they want everyone else to stop using airplanes so much? So that was interesting. And then, of course, when she landed in Vancouver and Edmonton, she loved to use taxis. So it really paints a picture of her being like many of the other environmentalists out there who want you to reduce your emissions. Well, of course, it's fine for them to collect Aeroplan points, use taxis all the time, and all kinds of other different activities. And a final example that I'll leave you with here is something that our organization has been working on, secondstreet.org. And what we've been able to do is actually gather government data on the number of patients that are dying on waiting lists each year. So instead of a cost, this is an actual stat, which of course is unflattering. And people are on waiting lists, and sadly many are dying while waiting for all kinds of different procedures, whether it's cataract surgery, knee and hip operations, some even dying while waiting for heart surgery, which in many cases could save their lives. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can use these two processes to get information that can help your cause. And so today we've got two experts that are going to be talking about this topic. First up, we have James Wood, who's an investigative journalist with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You can see, unfortunately, James is not with us here today. He had something come up at the last minute, but he is going to be participating by Zoom. And what James is going to walk you through is give you a whole bunch of tips and information on how you can file these requests, how you can do them well, how you can get the information that you're looking for, how you can avoid getting a big bill from the government in order to get it. So he's going to give you all kinds of tips and information on how to do that. And to my left here is Bruce Hallsor. He's a managing partner with Crease Harman. Basically, he does lots of legal work and helping clients when they don't get the information that they want. If they want to challenge the government and try to get that information and pry it out, because sometimes governments are not always cooperative when it comes to releasing information that they don't want you to see. So to kick things off, I'm going to turn it over to James, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about your tips and what you've learned over the years with filing Freedom of Information requests.
Can do. So I've got my wonderful presentation here, and I'll give folks cues for when we should move slides. So yeah, advanced age of FOIs, how to get the goods, how to make a broken system work best for you. Next slide, please. So when you're setting out on this stuff, there's things you want to keep in mind at all times from the get-go. When you're making these requests, you always want to be as focused as possible. The scope of the initial request can determine how long you wait and how much you might be paying. So it needs to be as precise as possible. It also needs to be as clear as possible, because this will determine your processing time. If you have a muddied, unclear request text, it won't make you any friends at the other end of the process, and it'll make your processing time even longer, because they might come back to you and say, oh, did you mean this? Did you mean that? Did you want this? Did you want that? All that kind of stuff. You also want to keep it simple. You don't need to write the great Canadian novel in each request you file or reinvent your wording each time. And I've got some great boilerplate language at the tail end of this presentation that you can essentially borrow from me after the fact, and you can use that for most of the requests you might need to file. Also, when you're setting up this process, when you have your reference points, whatever your source material you're bouncing off of in the first place, you always want to double check that stuff before you put the file in, before you put the request in, because otherwise you might end up spending $5 or $25 or however much you spent, and the processing time it takes, and because your initial source text was off, because you had the wrong impression from what you're filing for in the first place, it was a bust. So these are things that I keep in mind at all times when I'm filing this stuff. Next slide, please. So why bother with the stuff in the first place? Colin was talking a little bit about it, but the biggest thing is accountability. And from coming from me, I was coming out of newsrooms the last 6 years before I came into the CTF. And I noticed that sometimes, and I still notice it now, the news cycle will kind of linger on accountability issue for a couple of days and then move on to something else. And reporters might not bother to file FOIs and get at the heart of what was going on. Now that could be for a lot of reasons. Usually it's because they don't have time, or they don't think to file it. It's not part of their normal workflow, or it's too expensive, or the editors don't want to do it. Multiple reasons, but either way, they don't file it and things kind of keep going. But when requests are filed and when stuff is pulled out that way, some pretty big things can happen. So I've got some examples here from work we've been doing. There's the Global Affairs Mission Cultural Fund, which is essentially a slush fund used by embassies and different arms of global affairs around the world to pay for fun, strange artistic events and strange festivals, that kind of thing. That we've found examples like Taxpayers being billed thousands of dollars for a very strange art show in Germany. Another one, we're sending chefs to India for tens of thousands of dollars to cook for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, even though their Indian chefs are already there, that kind of thing. There's also Mr. Trudeau's Costa Rican vacation bills that we dug up from 2019, 2020, when he went down to Costa Rica vacation at that time. They go back and forth, but then there were 4 extra flights because D&D messed up their schedules, and that ended up costing taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars, all linked to Mr. Trudeau's Costa Rican vacation that people didn't know about until we filed access requests. There's also an expense program for governors general. After they leave the role, they're allowed to expense up to around $200,000 per year for their office expenses, and that program actually keeps going beyond the grave, because up to 6 months after they die, their estate can still submit office expense claims, and we wouldn't know about that unless we had filed for details around that program. Also, CMHC had been throwing money at home equity tax research and advocacy efforts, and we wouldn't know about that unless we had filed access information requests. So it's a huge accountability tool we can use to find this kind of information and remind the government they shouldn't be doing these kind of things. Next slide, please. When to FOI is always a fun question. These are kind of my basic guidelines. The big thing is oftentimes you'll see in news stories, my apologies, you'll see in news stories where the government is claiming policies, or they're saying there's certain expense amounts they're communicating around, and they say something cost X, but they don't actually they don't release the expense records that show you that the thing actually cost X. It's just some official saying that. So when you see a news story like that, you can say, oh, okay, they're claiming this. You go to the relevant department, you say, give me the expense records that correlate to this amount, or the spending that this amount is supposed to link to. And you can see if they're actually telling the truth or not. And there's been a few examples where we've done that, and it turns out the number is actually quite higher than what someone is claiming. The thing to always consider is always imagine what information is missing from a government report or policy advocacy or expense story in some way, shape, or form. See what information is missing. What do you think the average person needs to know more about on this topic? What additional angles do you think need to be explored on a given topic? And also, critical for us, how can finding more information about this advance your organization's goals? So the CTF mandate is lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. So that's what we're always, whenever I'm putting my access requests together, I'm always thinking about how can I advance that mandate? How can I find more information? How can I keep government more accountable by getting this information out into the public eye? That kind of thing. So that's crucial at times when you actually want to file access to information requests. Now, how to write a good request. Sorry, next slide, please. You're going on to how to write a good request, how to win friends and influence ATIP officers, because sometimes this is a very detailed process. Next slide, please. So you want to be, I mentioned this before, you want to be as specific as possible. If you make your request too wide, it can end up taking so long, the information you actually receive back isn't useful anymore. If it's, you make the request, and then 5 years later, you actually get the material, that probably won't be very useful. If you make your request too narrow, though, you can wind up spending $5 or more for something that isn't actually useful. They can come back and say, oh, that record doesn't exist, or something that fits that narrow definition you gave us doesn't actually exist. So it's a bit of a process to do, but you want to nail down exactly what you're looking for, keep it wide enough that you actually get material back, but not so narrow that nothing comes back. And communication with the actual processing officers that do this stuff is going to be very key. Next slide, please. The way to think of it is that you want to go into you want to tell them to go look at the right filing cabinet. That's how it was described to me a few years back by somebody doing ATIP for a very long time. Right? That stuck with me. So essentially, you're walking into whatever federal office or government office that you're filing to. You're walking into there. You're going to a certain person. You're saying, hey, I want to see records that fit this topic from this particular time frame, handled by these particular people, and I want to get it back within a reasonable time frame, hopefully. And you want to make sure your instructions are tailored in such a way that the person who's doing that search can go to that exact filing cabinet and go pull that exact topic, go between the records between those exact people, and come back to you with the least amount of change to your request, the least amount of processing time possible. If you can make that happen, you'll probably be in good shape. Because again, you don't want to make sure, you don't want to tell your searcher, go look for this, and they're going to go and look at the wrong spot, or they're going to take 5 years to come back and give you something. It won't be worth the money you spent or the time spent by that point when it comes back, usually. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through the filing process at the federal level, and there's various, the process is essentially the same across the board, federal, provincial, and municipal. Slight differences between the three levels, but federal, the same steps will basically apply everywhere. Next slide, please. So the federal system has a nice online portal, which is very useful. It's very accessible and pretty user-friendly now, in contrast to most of what I see of the federal online presence. The link is included in the slideshow for people to access after the fact. This is the first screen you'll see. It essentially lays out what's going to happen, how they collect information, that kind of thing. Pretty bog standard. Next slide, please. When you actually start the request now, it'll give you two options. It'll prompt it choose between general records and personal records. The vast majority of the time, you'll be choosing to pull general records. And you can see they give you some examples of what you might be pulling from here. Again, the portal was recently adjusted to be a lot more detailed, a lot more easy to use. Next slide, please. Once you actually select general records, you'll be taken to a window that lets you choose which institution you want to file to. And that list basically contains every single federal agency, department accessible via the online service, because that's what they changed to fit recently. Next slide, please. So when you're into that portal, you can search for departments by name. So for example, I've got CMHC here. I'll usually search by name myself because I know I'm looking for right off the bat. You can use the abbreviation, you can use the name of the organization. It's pretty user-friendly. It'll give you a big breakdown. You can just choose exactly one each. Now, and the thing to remember as well, with the federal portal, sometimes provinces do this differently, sometimes municipalities do this differently, but with the feds, with this particular portal, you can only submit one request at a time through each step of this process. So you can only choose one at a time, one institution, one request, and off you go. Next slide, please. Once you choose your institution, it'll take you to the actual request page. You'll be asked to confirm your citizenship and assign a request name, and then fill out the actual request form. So you can see some spaces here, Canadian citizen, you'll give it a little label now, and then the space below where you're inserting the description, it's gonna ask you, that's where you put the actual wording. Next slide, please. A couple guidelines for the end process of filing requests. Whenever you're choosing whenever you're choosing the delivery process, you want to make sure you choose electronic only. Unless you want to have a pile of papers sent to your mailbox, or you want to take a fun trip to Ottawa or wherever this office might be and inspect them in person. I have never actually heard of someone choosing to examine in person. I've met a few people who work in ATIP, and they say whenever someone actually chooses that option, it's a headache for everyone involved, and it's also very strange that someone would choose to do that. So don't choose that one. Always go for electronic. It's much easier for everyone involved. Just come straight to your email or to your ATIP Online account. There's also, there's a thing at the end here. Always choose not to identify yourself when they ask you what kind of requester that you are. I'll show you. There's some categories that come up on that front. Next slide, please. Next stage of the process, you'll get a prompt to insert a file relevant to your request if you have one. Now, the vast majority of the time, I don't use this step because I don't have to, but sometimes there'll be circumstances when you might need to. So for instance, if you're filing a request on someone else's behalf, you might get a permission slip from them saying, I give you, this person, permission to file access requests on my behalf. You would take that file, you take that slip of paper, that permission slip, and you attach it to your request at that point. And that's the only time you're using this page. Usually pretty straightforward. Next slide, please. You'll need to provide your contact information once in this portal, but once it's loaded in, you won't have to enter it in any more times again, luckily, because they'll save information now. Before you had to enter it in every single time, which is a bit of a pain. Now it's saved and it's much more smooth, and essentially just family name, given name, address, all that kind of stuff. Pretty straight. Next step, please. They'll prompt you to choose your language of service and your preferred communication method. So I usually go with English and email. You can choose telephone, letter, or fax, but email is going to be probably your best friend. Like I said, there's a key step here where they ask you what kind of requester that you identify as. Now, I've been told always choose the option prefer not to respond, because essentially this request will go through, and while they're not supposed to prioritize different levels or deprioritize certain types of requests, if you put member of the public or academia or media or NGO in some way, shape, or form, they might put your request on the back burner or rearrange it in some way, shape, or form. So by choosing prefer not to respond, you kind of, it might not defeat it entirely, but you kind of slow that process down. So that's what I always choose, prefer not to respond. Next slide, please. Payment, quick and simple, just online credit card window. So you'll get the final summary of your request, and then you'll get the pay now option. And then again, it's just you enter your credit card information, and off you go. Pretty simple. Next slide, please. So the only problem, hurdle really, with the federal system, with the federal portal right now, is that depending on who you're requesting to, it'll split into two different portals. If the destination of your request is going to the second service, to the legacy service, you'll be prompted to head over to it. And there are 7 departments on that service. That's the CBSA, the CRA, CSIS, Employment Social Development, Immigration, National Defense, and the RCMP. Usually, I haven't had to file the CSIS pretty much ever, for the most part. I've had to file the other ones a few times, and that process can be a bit of a pain because, as I mentioned before, you have to enter your personal information once to put your address and your number in, that kind of thing. On this particular side of the portal, you have to do that every single request, which is annoying, but it's hopefully they'll sort that out sooner rather than later. Next slide, please. You can see an example. This is what that other service looks like. You get to choose which institution you're filing to. You go to there's a select window. You just choose which one's there, and then you go through and you enter in your information from all those windows. So you do that every single time if you're submitting to those 7 other departments. Bit of a pain, but hopefully they'll sort it out soon. Next slide, please. In that same legacy arm, get to choose, they'll prompt you, are you choosing under the Access to Information Act or the Privacy Act? Again, you'll always choose Access to Information Act, and off you go. Next slide, please. Some departments in that same portal, again, they'll ask you whether or not the request is including personal information on you or someone you're representing. The answer is going to be no, usually. From that point forward, the process is pretty much the same. You just put in your wording, and then essentially it'll take you to the payment window, and then you're done. Next slide, please. So that's the basic steps for the federal portal. And then when you go to the provincial and municipal level, it's a bit different. The process of making requests is still basically the same across all levels of government, but once you're out of the federal system, the fee to file can vary wildly between provinces, and you may have to pay additional processing fees depending on what's going on with your request. The federal fee to file is $5. British Columbia, the Yukon, Alberta, Prince Edward Island, and Ontario, they'll have online services to submit access requests, which is nice. Quebec, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Labrador, the Northwest Territories, none of it all have forms you can fill out and send directly to the relevant access to information departments or officials, which is also pretty straightforward. The municipal level, things get a bit more complicated. Toronto has a portal, for example, which is quite nice. Ottawa, you can just basically take the form they give you and you fill it out, you send it back to them by email. Some levels are a bit different. For example, if I was filing to the arm of Wilton near Lloydminster, I needed to call the office 3 times over and tell them I want to make an access to information request. Once they figured out what that was, I could send them the form they gave me. But regardless of the approach needed, the basic processes all remain the same. You're going to put your wording together, you're going to fill out whatever form they give you, whatever portal they ask you to fill out, and you send it in and off you go. Next slide, please. The additional fees can be a bit of a killer. So like I said, the federal system, $5 charge per request. That's the only payment you'll ever need to make. If they ever ask you to pay more than that, there's something going on strange with your request, but usually it's only $5. Provincial and municipal can charge initial higher fees and processing fees. So Alberta charges $25 for the initial request. BC charges $10. Processing fees can pile up depending on what you're asking for. If it's piles and piles of records, it's basically dollars and cents per page, and that could lead to $200 plus bills. So something to watch for. Usually that will come down to a bit of a negotiation between you and the processing office to figure out what you might need and what you might actually be paying for. Next slide, please. So the fun part, my commonly used wordings, my apologies. This is a good tool you guys can come away with here. So these are the wordings I tend to use most when I'm pulling for certain topics. If I'm pulling for communication between officials, usually what I call chatter requests, this is the wording that I used. So I'm asking for anything that went between them, electronic correspondence and data sent received by officials with management of the file regarding or discussing the subject in the time frame of the request. Now, sometimes when I'm going into officials with the line here with officials with management of the file, I can change that around if I know the specific ranks of the people that I'm looking for. If it's a certain managerial level and above, or a certain official, a certain named official, I could just put their name in directly. That's worked out quite well. But just for the sake of ease, for people adapting this language after the fact, I'll just say officials with management of the file, and then you can take that and adapt from there. Now, the boilerplate language at the bottom is very key. I asked them to search through electronic records only unless relevant records don't exist in that format. So essentially, I want to go to the format that's most easily searched first, which is electronic records. They can go through those and they can do search keywords, they can pull it from emails, that kind of thing, and it's going to be more straightforward than pulling paper records and trying to go through those by hand. But I don't want to leave those records out in case the material that I'm looking for doesn't exist electronically. So that's why I include unless relevant records do not exist in that format. That means if there's nothing electronically and there might be something to search, they'll go and do that. If you don't include that language, they might go through electronic records only and then leave it there if they don't find anything. So you're cutting yourself off at the knees for no reason. Then include documents in which cabinet material can be severed. However, exclude documents marked cabinet competence in their entirety. Now, I have that wording there because cabinet competence is a fun obstacle I run into at the federal level very often. And if you don't deal with it right off the bat, they might come back to you and say, "Oh, your request has cabinet competence material, has cabinet material included in it. Do you want to receive that material? Do you want to have it reviewed, or do you want to leave it out entirely?" And usually, if you want to keep it in there or ask for it kept in there, your processing time will go up very much, very, very long. And at the end of the day, it's unlikely you'll get it because cabinet competence is they tend to use it as a very umbrella term that you can't get this material because cabinet competence, and off you go. So you've wasted time that you could have been spending going through the actual documents you would have received anyway. So I tell them, if there's cabinet competence material, sever it from the records that you can. Take the pages that you can knock that material out of and knock it out, but exclude the documents marked cabinet competence in their entirety. So that means if there's a page with cabinet material on it, they can go and remove that material and say they've removed that cabinet competence material instead of removing the entire page, which sometimes officers will try and do. Eliminate duplicate emails and chains. That's just to get rid of anything that would be a waste of time doubling up the size of the records package because you'll see it twice anyway. Remove French versions of English if English exists. Again, that's just to remove any doubles that would be, it's the same record in French that would be in English. Final versions of docs or last draft of final versions not available. That's just, again, you're cutting down on the records you have to go through because the only stuff that usually matters is the final version or the last draft. And then the time frame. So I'll pick whatever relevant start date, and for a long time, I was trying to figure out my best end dates. I'd be trying to pick the day of I was filing, or if I was writing the request the one day and I put a date in, and then I filed it a couple days afterwards, I'd have to change the date anyway. So I just figured it'd be easier for everyone involved if I just put the actual end date of the request to the date that the request is received. So that means the clock will actually start ticking when the officer picks it up and starts processing it. And that way it's easier for them to assign an end date and for you because you don't have to worry about assigning dates every time you're writing a request. Next slide, please. So another one, travel expenses is very fun. I've used this wording very effectively for a number of federal officials. Probably the best one was when Chrystia Freeland went to Scotland for a environmental conference in Glasgow, but stayed in Edinburgh instead and went back and forth for a few days using luxury chauffeur transport meant for golf transport, which is great. And I got those records back with this essential wording request. So I'll be asking for the scope of travels by whatever individual you're looking for during the time frame of the request. Give me every cost that the department covered that's linked to them, incurred personally by that person, related to or as a result of the trip, including the date of the cost, the vendor, the amount paid, and the description they received back. And then again, I have my boilerplate language. You can also expand that same request wording to cover individuals traveling with that person, as well as all costs linked to the trip that are not incurred by individuals. So if you have certain costs that were incurred by one person while they were traveling, and they were traveling as part of a delegation in some way, shape, or form, you also put a request in asking for everything that the department covered for the entire delegation, not just that one person. And that way you get a pretty complete picture of what was being paid for these given trips. Worked very well for the Freeland story. That was quite fun. Next slide, please. Another one is going to be grants. So you'll see the constant flow of federal money for small projects in small towns or strange corporate welfare projects. So if you want to see what's going on at the back end with those grants and those they hand out of federal money, you can ask for all the chatter between officials regarding the grant itself, and you would just take that wording I've got here. Give me everything regarding the application for the eventual approval of government funds for the project mentioned here, and you'd have like a link to the announcement or a link to the news story about the announcement or some summary from the federal grant portal, that kind of thing. And I usually just go 1 year before approval and the date the request is received, and that usually covers the entire time frame that might be useful. And then at the tail end here, I ask for a copy of the final funding agreement. So that one's pretty straightforward. Don't need any boilerplate language there, because you're just going to the relevant department and saying, you have an agreement with this agency or this institution for this funding agreement. I would like to see the actual agreement you guys signed together, and you can see what the deliverables, what the demands of the contract are, that kind of thing. Usually that's not released off the hop. They just have a quick summary on the federal portal. This way you can the actual documents itself.
James, it's Colin. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, I can.
Just keeping an eye on the clock, I want to make sure we get a chance to chat with Bruce. We are going to come back to you during the question period. So if you want to just in the meantime think about anything that is really important that you want to add during that point. Like I said, just in the interest of time, I want to turn it over to Bruce. But before I do,
sure thing.
Just by a show of hands, how many here have ever filed a Freedom of Information request or access to information request? Okay, good. So it looks like probably about a third of the room, a quarter of the room, just
nice.
for keeping that in mind. Bruce, James has walked us through how we go about filing these requests. James and I both talked about some great stories and ways that organizations can actually get information out. It doesn't always work out that way, that governments are cooperative in wanting to release the information. So what types of options do people have if the government refuses, but you actually think that you have a legitimate right to getting that information and that it exists? What can people do?
Let me follow up, start with a follow-up question. It looked like about a dozen people here, maybe a few more, had filed requests. How many of you have had to appeal to the commissioner or something in your request? So just a couple. Have any of those had to go beyond to a court? One, okay. Well, that's good. I think that a lot of times difficulties with requests, if people don't do things the way James says, they eventually can get them filled by a bit of back and forth with the officers that they're dealing with. The officer will come back and say, this is going to take 10 years, or this is a problem, or I can't find it, and the request will get amended, and these kind of internal things can happen. I've also heard lots of stories where somebody didn't get satisfaction with one officer, and they just try the same request and hope to get somebody else, and they find somebody who's better at it. and somebody told them, oh, we can't get that, and the other person produces it. So you never know. But leaving that aside, the federal system and all the provincial systems have internal appeal mechanisms. They all require you to try to work with the officer who's been assigned to your case and have some back and forth. And those appeal mechanisms only kick in when you're at a standstill. You're asking for something and you're told you're not going to get it, or you're told that the time it's going to take you to get it is something that's beyond what the statute allows, and you're not going to consent to that extension. All of the statutes require some kind of timely action on the part of the Freedom of Information officers, and often they will come back and tell you, we can't meet that. And all of the acts give them the ability to do that a number of times for certain reasons, and you can go beyond those times if you consent. But if you're not going to consent and they can't fulfill that, then there's an internal appeal mechanism. And the internal appeal mechanisms are to a commissioner, in most cases that's what they're called, and they're somebody who stands separate and apart from the departmental people that do these information requests, and they will decide if the request for extra time is reasonable or warranted or not, and they will decide if the request will be denied or not. In my personal experience, the absolute denials tend to be issues of cabinet confidences. The federal legislation is pretty clear. One section says they don't have to give you things that are cabinet confidential material. There's a big list of what that constitutes. And then there's another section that says, well, this doesn't apply if, and the big ifs are if it's been more than 20 years, or if the information that went to cabinet is publicly available, or is part of a report that was generally available in the bureaucracy and wasn't specially something for cabinet, even if it went to cabinet. So those kind of things are not typically requests for how much did somebody spend on orange juice or hotels when they were away. They tend to be requests for briefing notes or studies and this sort of thing. And the reason why people look for those bits of information is a politician has made a decision, has said we're going to do this, here's the reason why we're going to do it, and you think that's not the reason at all. and Chris knows. And so you want to see what the real briefing was, or the real studies that were before them, and under the Act you should be able to have most of those. But the commissioners are separate and apart from the FOI system. They are ultimately appointees of the government. Some of them are very good. Courts have said many times that access to information is a quasi-constitutional right of Canadians. The kind of information that is covered by access to information or FOI legislation belongs to the public. It does not belong to government. And that's why this whole legislative scheme is set up to give you access to it. And many of the commissioners take that very seriously, but they also are not judges. They are not secure until they're 75 years of age in their office. They are going to be reappointed by government when their term is up. And you'd be naive to think that there isn't some influence on people in that. If somebody's too much of a problem for the government, a government that doesn't like the decisions they made, they may not be reappointed. So that's just a reality you have to live with. Beyond those people, if they don't give you the satisfactory response, at the federal level you have to go to federal court, and at provincial level you generally go to Court of King's Bench or Supreme Court in BC, whatever the superior trial level court is in your province. When you go to court, it's a little bit tricky because what you're asking for is something that legally is called an order in the nature of mandamus, where you're asking for the court to order the government to give you a document or a set of documents that they don't want to give you. And generally, if the commissioner has made an order in your favor and the government still hasn't complied, and that does happen, then you have a strong legal case. But often what the commissioner does is will make recommendations, and we'll go through it and say the government has taken too long, or what the government has supplied hasn't been enough, and I think they're wrong, and I recommend the government deal with this within a certain period of time, or what. That's not an order. And the government can ignore orders of the commissioners. It can't ignore orders of the courts. The courts are usually reluctant to order more than the commissioner gave. They show a lot of deference to what the commissioners do. Some of these cases have been appealed to courts of appeal, either the Federal Court of Appeal or provincial courts of appeal. A few have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada. That's where the language comes from about that the access to this information is a public right. I think if you read the cases from a courts of appeal and Supreme Court, they're quite sympathetic to access to information. The precedents that are out there are very good, and they do talk about this principle that this stuff belongs to the public, and it's really incumbent on the government to make a case at that level for why this can't be provided. That's not always the case at the commissioner level. The commissioners, the government can say it's a cabinet confidence. They don't have to give reasons that you as the requester are going to know about. You can guess, but it doesn't have to be laid out. In a court setting it does. So that's a very general basic thing. I think we have 9 minutes left, so I don't know if you want to go back to James after that or not.
Yeah, well, James, we'll come to you in a minute, but we will be taking questions from the audience. So, I'm getting the nod that we won't be doing. We've got 3 minutes, so no questions from the audience. But James, things are evolving quickly here, folks.
No trouble.
James, were there any final points that you thought were really important for people to know before they file one of these requests?
I was kind of echoing what Bruce was saying, just because you kind of, when you end up with cross purposes on a request, it'll come down to sometimes your best friend is the ATIP officer. So I was going to say, when you're talking to those folks, it costs you nothing to be nice. You want to be as friendly and approachable as possible, because they're the ones who are going to help you along the way get this material. And if you present that approach to them, they'll be nice to you as well. Now, other times you'll end up with nasty folks who are by the book or just straight up mean, and that's when you can be a bit more firm with them. And if they're going against the act, you cite specific examples. You can say you messed up here, XYZ reason. But I've been very lucky most of the time. My approach seems to be working, where if I'm just basically nice to them, they're nice to me back, and everything kind of goes relatively smoothly. And also sometimes responses that you get back, if you get the records package back and it seems wrong or incomplete in some way, shape, or form, it can be just that. I've had maybe like 10 or 11 requests where the package comes back and I've been like, was there something missing here, or are you sure this is supposed to go this way, this is the way it went? And they've been like, oh, hold on a second, yeah, I did make a mistake here. And usually that gets fixed in like a week or so, or even shorter, and it comes back in a better way. So that was just my last point there. When you're dealing with the actual people in the system, you just be as nice as possible, and usually it goes pretty well, usually.
I just want to say one thing about James. I know why you always choose the electronic response, which makes a lot of sense for what you do. There are some less sophisticated organizations out there, some municipalities, crown corporations and stuff, where I've heard of cases where you should ask for to pick up the hard copy, because sometimes all the blackout lines, you can read through them. And you can't do that when they email it to you. So just a little hack for somebody if you're interested.
One other benefit of that, there was once I filed a request with a particular government body, and the person who gave me the responses made a mistake. She gave me the copy that had the whiteout on it instead of the copy of the sheet with the whiteout. So I was able to take this whiteout and just scratch it off and see exactly what they were hiding, which I don't think was their intention initially, but it is one benefit.
That's good.
If they deliver that to you, it's not illegal to do that, though. That's a document that's been given to you.
That's right. We're going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you both for giving us some initial ideas about how to file these requests and what the options are if we have to challenge them.